Wow. I'm going to turn that down a little bit because there is something that has sound to it, and that was really uncomfortable. I think we experienced that now. Okay, cool. Oh, yeah. How's that? Is that nice? Okay. All right. Cool. All right. So we are recording. I'm gonna do this. Presents. Awesome. Okay.
Awesome. Okay. Welcome to the final Thrive event of the day. I think I've seen all of you throughout the day already, but for people who are also watching the recording later, I just wanted to say a few words about Thrive Yoga, which we have every Monday at 7 p.m. Audrey Cash teaches that. And every Thursday morning from 8:30 to 9:30, I teach yoga. And that both of those classes are in the spiritual formation room in Canton Chapel. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nia Baker, who's going to talk to us about trauma and the body.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks. It's nice to be here with y'all and get to talk to you a little bit about, I termed this neurobiological safety. My full name is Nia, but I go by Nia most of the time. And I currently work as a counselor, so I work as a licensed counselor in Georgia, and then I am a student here. So I'm getting my master's in theological studies, and I'm focusing on the intersections between theology, public health, psychology, and neuroscience. So understanding how our bodies and minds do this whole thing of living, and how to do that connected to ourselves, each other, and to the Creator. So I'm just going to start with, and I think we're all pretty familiar with this, neurobiological stress. So stress that we feel, not just feel in the sense that we know that we are stressed, we have thoughts that we are stressed, but we also feel stress physically, is part of everyday life. We all experience it. I've been excited to get to experience some work, and this is some of my training and background, particularly with a focus on trauma. So neurobiological stress is part of everyday life, and what does it mean to experience something that's traumatic? These are a couple of the professors that I've gotten to work with, and I know the same before, and so I always make sure that I do a little homage to them because I would not be here without them. So when we're talking about stress, we're talking about trauma, a lot of times people immediately, actually I'll move this over so you can see the slide. Just kind of that. We talk a lot about what do we do when we are experiencing stress? How do we cope with it? And so this slide talks about the difference between bottom up versus top down processing. Bottom up versus top down experiences that might help us deal with everyday stress. So bottom up, has anyone heard of the term bottom up processing? It's kind of like a newer term. Oh, yeah. So some people are familiar with this and they're like, this is very new. Bottom up just basically means anything that we're processing and we're processing it through our senses. So we're not thinking about it, we're actually experiencing it. Top down would be we're using the prefrontal cortex area of our brain. We're thinking about what's happening, how it's happening, and trying to make meaning of it. So when we think of like a bottom up type experience, we can think of yoga, which I know we've talked a little about already with Thrive, doing some yoga here. You could think about going for a walk. You could think about sticking our feet in the sand and feeling sand between our toes. These are all ways that bottom up process things. When we're talking about top down, it's being in a classroom. Now, there are bottom up things that are happening probably in a classroom, and a lot of times the primary way that we are experiencing is through thinking. So this slide is supposed to give us an idea of what are the benefits of both bottom up versus top down processing. What are the ways that we can support ourselves using either one? And I started with this because we're going to go into understanding what stress looks like, but I want us to have a framework of how we can support ourselves so that you can be thinking about what makes the most sense for me, as well as how do I even think about the way I'm experiencing the world through this lens. So the pros of bottom-up processing are, it really is a nervous system support. talk about yoga, right? It's a way to stretch, it's a way to move, reconnect with their body. It's practical and hands-on, great for kids, it's basically really, really fun. But it can also be a little uncomfortable if we are not sure that we're able to move or sense things in a way that feels totally right or comfortable. The cons of bottom-up processing is that there's limited learning about thought patterns, which makes sense. We might not really be thinking a whole lot while we're doing it. We're really focusing on sensing. On the opposite side, we have top-down. So the pros are builds new insight and new thought patterns. That is what seminary or school or any sort of graduate program or elementary school, any sort of learning, right, is about building new ways of thinking. It's really popular if we're thinking about therapy related to some of this stuff. That a lot of times we talk about talk therapy. So it can help us build new skills towards mastery. The cons is that especially, and I say this, and I wanted to start with this again, especially for people, for those of us who've experienced a lot of complex trauma, who've experienced a lot of ways that the world doesn't totally feel safe, or we have a limited access to language, top-down processing can be really challenging. Because the way we experience the world is through this sensory information, and we're trying to figure out what's safe and not safe. And so we're just learning through thoughts. We're kind of missing out about how that actually connects with our bodies. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, if we're going to talk about trauma, or if we're going to talk about stress, we have to talk about conflict. Because conflict is normally when we experience stress. I'm curious if y'all, and it's so interesting, I'm primarily a therapist, individual therapist, group therapist, also the student in class that probably talks way too much, as well as like wants people to engage with her. So I'm curious if y'all think about conflict, would you engage with me? What are some types of conflict that y'all think about?
Just like household chores.
Oh my gosh, that is like one of the best examples because I think it is highly relatable. Everyone in some way, shape, or form has had to figure out, if I'm living with another person, how are we going to keep things either clean or organized or anything? And everyone has their own idea about how to load a dishwasher. Everyone does, right? So yeah, we might have a conflict about something around getting a chore done. Yeah.
I think in this setting that like was in one of my classes was teaching parish oftentimes as pastors, ministry, church, things like that, we about church conflict.
Yeah.
Like simple things of like, oh, the colors of the pews or the the floor or you name it, right? So it's just like navigating conflict within the ministry settings. That's what I think about as well.
That's such a great example too, because it's around, we're in a setting together and we're thinking about what we're seeing or what we're sitting on and how different people might experience it differently. And it can create some conflict when different people have different preferences. Yeah, as well. Holidays, yes.
And relatedly, grief associated with holidays, that starts showing itself in forms that grief.
Yeah. So the way that we experience celebration, something like a holiday where we're coming together, and then also the different emotions that might be happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And how that then might lead us to behave in different ways and that might create conflict with one another. And with all of these, we're talking about two things or multiple things happening at the same time. And I think, especially in that holiday example, gives us a really great place to say, yes, think about being at a party or being at an event and coming in, one person comes in feeling so excited to be there, and the other person comes in feeling really anxious because they're not sure either they'll be accepted, or maybe they're coming in anxious because they just almost got in a car accident. Or maybe they're coming in with frustration related to something entirely different, but we're all coming together. And so how do we sit with those multiple things that are happening at the same time? So I adapted this from the type of therapy that I do a lot, which is dialectical behavioral therapy. I used what they use as kind of the dialectic, and I put these two on here, and I think it kind of fits a lot of what we're experiencing in the last few years. I think it's probably always been true. I mean, it has always been true, but especially in the last couple of years, I think it's this question that we are always sitting with: what is known, what is unknown? And so both of those things are true at the same time, any given experience. We always come in with what we think we know. We always come in with what we experience in the moment, but there's also going to be the part that's unknown. And what I'd like for us to think about is this question around possibility. The dialectic of the known and the unknown as a place of possibility. And I was talking about this recently with actually in one of the classes that I'm in right now in the public health department, and read about the impossible. How that as people of faith, we're sitting with the impossible daily. We know in some ways that it is not happening, and yet we are asking, when will it happen? We're sitting with this question of what will be. And this is stressful. It's just stressful because it can impact us in all sorts of different ways. So possibility in itself can be both anxiety-provoking, terrifying, and really exciting, really hopeful at the same time. So we can talk about that, and that's even some wonderful meaning-making kind of stuff. And from a neuroscience perspective, we know that the neurobiological goal of every person is to survive. There's something in our brain and body that says, how do I make it one more day? How do I make it one more minute? And for some of us, we might live a very planned life where we're like, we imagine the future. Like the future is happening, it's gonna happen. We're just kind of planning out how we want it to happen. For some of us, especially if you've experienced a lot of events that cause us to believe that the future is very uncertain, even the next moment is a question of survival. Even the next moment is a question around how I'm going to show up, how I'm going to proceed, what will happen next. And so with that, all of us have our own, and this is one of the counseling psychological terms that I'm doing sort of like kind of an intersectional way. We have a window of tolerance. We talk about tolerance as this way to sort of experience something new. Okay, cool, yeah, we can do that, I can do that, we're okay. The window of tolerance in psychological terms is thinking about time, over time, and the intensity of the experience, how I will stay, I'm going to sort of point right here, in the sweet spot, that space between the lower and upper limit. That's the sweet spot. That's a spot where I can make decisions, where I can learn, where I can grow. For some of us, though, it could be that throughout the day, throughout the next moment, as we experience stress, the intensity of our emotion gets so high that we move outside of our window of tolerance. And when we do that, we're no longer actually experiencing what is presently happening. Our body's kind of shifted into this survival mode. Some people talk about it as like the flight or fight. We'll talk a little bit about that. I have some of these little pictures on here to indicate some of the things that I experience related to some of these window of tolerance examples. So if we're using an emotion like joy, for instance, we think about kind of the intensity of the emotion. There's like this little lotus right here. Talk about that as like being like pretty chill, right? I'm like pretty like settled, content, feeling good. I'm on the lower end of the window of tolerance. I'm not really super active, I'm not really engaging. I'm just kind of like present. Maybe you see a flower, maybe I see flowers, stop me. I see a flower, I'm like, ooh, cool, yeah, I'm into that. That's interesting. I recently, I got married this last year, and my wife and I went on like a short little honeymoon, and I saw a sea turtle for the first time, and I have now lost my whole mind because I was so excited. I was really, really close to the upper limit of my tolerance. I was like racing after it, like, oh my gosh, it's gonna be awesome. I did not catch it, but I was very excited. I got a video. If I were to ever see a whale, game over. I do not think I would survive. I would just be so excited. And we can think about this with other emotions too. We can think about over time as that intensity rises, especially when thinking about something like fear or anger or sadness. That, and you guys can think about this, especially if you've done pastoral counseling or worked with people or you're sitting with them, chaplaincy, you're sitting with them, you notice they're more and more emotional, and that's important, it's beautiful. And there are times where it's almost like we hit this level of stress, this upper limit where I'm no longer necessarily connecting with the person because they've actually in some ways disconnected from their body as a survival strategy. So I don't think this is gonna work. We're gonna talk about attainment. I don't know if any of y'all have seen this before. Oh no. Let's see, I might just have to do it on a separate night.
You push the 3 buttons, and then you can pull it down so it gets out of your way.
Press push.
So go up to the top, right? And then the 3 buttons, and just pull that down, and then get out of your way. Okay.
Oh, I see. Okay. If it comes back,
Yeah.
if it comes back, I'll be ready. Okay. All right. I wish I could say this is experiment. There we go. Still face experiments.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the activity and the social interaction that they get from the world around. This is something that we started studying 34 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. And still face experiment that the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I don't like that. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They were working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points.
This is breaking my heart.
The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing. It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
when I go back to the slides, I heard people responding to it. Anything you want to respond about it? What did y'all notice? What was it like watching this, the connection that the baby was trying to have, and then also the stress that you saw the baby respond?
I'm like deeply fascinated with necessarily, but the stress, like the moment of obviously like the joy, the play, then she turns around, comes back, and the baby in the moment of like chaos and the stress. I'm interested of like the body, with the body, mind, everything happens within the baby in that moment when all of a sudden mom is like, oh, like now we're joyous and like, hey, gonna redirect and everything's fine, like to console the baby. What happens in the body for that child, and how that, like, what is the body, how does the body carry that over time? Or like, what does it remember? And like that variable of the unknown, it's like we don't really know. But there's some factor, or factors, I feel like over time that it's just so fascinating. Some like what we do remember, what we don't, but then what our body holds. And that aspect of, and our current climate, the world, all of the things that are going on, I feel like we're just out of tune.
Yeah.
Out of like the sensory, out of the body all the time, that we're just autopilot. So yeah, I don't know. Not just this video, but just things overall when we talk about trauma in the body. It's just so interesting to me, like what we're attentive to, what we're not, but then how we continue in the roles that we serve, the things that we do, what comes up and what doesn't, and then, or how is it there? Yeah, so just a lot of things. So I'll be quiet.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you're saying. It's asking some of how does the body hold it? It does.
Yes.
And then also, what are the patterns that we kind of slip out of?
Right.
And when we're not in attachment, it's really hard to get out of those patterns. Yeah.
I was gonna say that this made me also think about like in my Erickson class that I took last semester, like how like
I'm sorry, what class?
Erickson.
Oh,
The first semester, the first life stage, one of the like things that Erickson talks about overcoming is like the challenge of whether to trust or mistrust the world. And how like I think what's so important about this video isn't so much that the mom is like always there, but that the mom like comes back. And that the mom like is like engaging and like, isn't like, because like I think sometimes people can like be like, okay, like I need to make sure that like I'm always there for my kid, but then you can border on being intrusive, and that can also be traumatizing for the child. So I think like that repair process, I think is just so like chef's kiss. Yeah.
One of the things we talk about in the classes that I've taken and the work I've done related to trauma is trust is built based on rupture and repair. If there's no rupture, if there's no moment of what if, right, or not knowing, unknown, then we don't actually get to experience the possibility and then the repair and the connection. The challenge, of course, is identifying how do we do that and how do we understand the world in that way and believe that it's still possible. I almost was thinking too, I was like thinking about that moment with babies all over the place. And from like some of the readings I've done, what I've been fascinated about is even the relationship between that and our understanding of God. Thinking about if we're experiencing God as some sort of parent or caring figure, what kind of dark night of the soul do we have when we just can't find them? So Thomas Hogel, I read one of his books related to some of the studying and learning and all that kind of stuff this last year. And he writes about trauma, he writes about relationship. And I thought this was a really interesting quote that he said, relationship is not a thing, it usage of relation is resonance. This is something that I'm really, really curious about is resonance. The resonance means feeling and sensing. It's not just a thought exercise. Relating means I feel you feeling me. I'm going to feel you. And how you feel me, that's the reason of relation. So this is the data stream. Within the field of psychology and neuroscience, there are 5 main cues that there's a particular psychologist, counselor who created kind of a therapy modality called radically open dialectical behavioral therapy. It's really just using principles that are neuroscientific. And these are the 5 cues that he talked about. So without getting like really, really into the weeds, what it really just means is that in every moment, our brain is picking up these cues around us related to our safety, related to our connection. And if we aren't feeling safe, which he would say is the state, even when we think about coming out of the womb, right? And having that first moment of connection. If you think about being in the womb, there's connection there. And I think it's still a mystery. I know some of us have studied it more than others. And there's safety. So we come out, and then there's this question around what is the world? So from our safety cue, we enter into the unknown. The unknown is what we would describe as novelty. So the safety cue, to go back, if we're getting really like neuroscientific, it is our parasympathetic nervous system, and it's our ventral vagal complex. And it's this nerve that runs all the way from our brain all the way down to that. It does everything related to our breathing, down to our digestion. And it is, when we are feeling safe, it is rest, digest, repeat. It's like a really good sleep, a really good connection with a friend. We don't even have to talk, we just know we're okay. Novelty is kind of a shift from that, and we actually just stand still. Our body is not sure yet how to respond. The activity is towards opening to what is. So you can see there's and actually I should say PNC, so the parasympathetic nerve, that's withdrawn, and the sympathetic nervous system isn't activated. That is where we get into the reward threat cue. So in any given moment, we're experiencing something as novel, and novel can mean new, it could mean unexpected, it could mean startling. In any of those, though, we go into one of these cues, usually either safety, reward, or threat. So safety here we talked about. Reward and threat are actually both based on the same nervous system parts, the sympathetic nervous system, and that's our go. The question is where we're going to go. Are we going to go towards whatever it is, or are we going to go away from whatever it is? When we're in the reward state, we want to go towards. We want to be connected to whatever it is, not necessarily to connect and attach, but typically in a way that benefits us. So maybe it is something like, I don't know, someone brings in some wonderful gluten-free chocolate chip brownies, and I just am like, immediately, I'm like, I'm not even gonna do this presentation anymore. I like walk over to the door and get a brownie. I'm so activated towards like, let's have that brownie. We can think about that in other ways, though. We can think about that towards maybe someone we really enjoy being around. Maybe it's achievement-based, especially in settings like this. We get a lot of really great rewards related to academic achievement, if that's something that is satisfying to us. And so that reward cue gets activated over and over and over again. And if you're thinking about it from a neurobiological perspective, this is where that dopamine rush, if you've ever heard people talk about that, shoots in. It can be especially intense and productive related to, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. This is where we can get this like really intense attachment sometimes happening. If we're not aware of it and aware of our ability to pause before you move towards whatever feels rewarding. The threat cue is when we feel threatened, right? We feel anxious, worried, and it's a defensive posture. One of the things that's really interesting, as they study this more is that a lot of times when people talk about fight or flight, right? You hear kind of that like fight, flight, freeze. You've ever heard anyone talk about that in trauma terms. It's actually, if you study kind of organisms and the way they respond in an environment, it's flight, fight, freeze. If I am feeling threatened and I have the ability to escape, that is my brain's first mode of defense. To get up. A lot of us have possibly been in situations where leaving wasn't really an option, or to leave was actually more threatening than to stay. And so we might actually move against. So moving against would be fighting. And we don't have to just fight with our fists, we might fight sort of in a defensive posture with our words, with our ideas, but in a way that we're not really able to take in information, we're pushing against whatever is being offered or pushed at us. One of the things I think is the most interesting about all of this related to our brains and the senses and all that kind of stuff is that there's this muscle in our ear. When we're in, I'll just go back for a second. When we're in a threat state, our entire body gets tense. Anybody experience that? It's like all of a sudden your body's like ready to move. It's like I'm gonna run, I'm gonna fight, or do whatever it is. Even if I know I'm not moving or doing anything at all, my body feels tense, and that's what we get in our shoulders, on our neck. There's also this muscle in our middle ear that tightens, and when we're in safety, it tightens and opens in a way that we hear what's happening around us. When we're in threat, it tightens in a way that it's hypersensitive to whatever the threat is, but actually like pushes out anything else.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Isn't this crazy? So it means when you like, let's say you had like an argument with your partner or something, and they're like, I definitely said it, and you're like, no, you did not. It is possible, this is the worst for me when I found out. I was like, it is possible that my body was actively not listening because I was in threat mode. I wasn't present. I was feeling threatened. And if we're in that threatened state long enough, or maybe the reward state, whichever one it is, the gas is gone, right? It's like a tank of gas. Not actually gone. The tank of gas is gone. You've been driving this car, you can go and go and go. The tank of gas is gone. We go to an overwhelmed view. Overwhelmed means there's no gas left, and we're going to move in. So a lot of, if you think about trauma, especially complex trauma, we've been in situations where we couldn't get away, we couldn't fight, we were overpowered. The brain, essentially, the brain and body play possum. Has anyone ever seen a possum play possum? It's pretty impressive. The craziest part about it is in the moving inward, our body is trying to protect itself. And so we don't feel pain as much. So even if we were attacked in that moment, the body is defensively trying to create the possibility for us to just hold on long enough where then escape can happen. So it centralizes all of its energy, and I'm just going to use that in sort of a general sense rather than going into all the little bits and details. So we don't feel pain as intensely. We kind of don't even really feel as intensely. So we're not really feeling joy, we're not really feeling fear or anger, we're just kind of numb. And especially for people who've experienced a lot of trauma, and think about kind of sitting, sometimes if I'm sitting with somebody and I can recognize they've moved into a state of overwhelm, you kind of look at someone, or even see it in yourself, and you're like, it's almost like I'm here but not here. You kind of see it in their eyes, it's like they've gone inside themselves to protect themselves. So all of this helps us understand what the body's doing at any given moment. So we have a few minutes left, but I want to give us a moment, especially after getting a lot of information. The brain is trying to move it all around, think about it, all that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to show you a few pictures and let you know that one of the most effective things that we can do for our brain, and I think this is so fascinating, is yawn. So if you're thinking about, if you're ever in a place where yawning is an option, I would just encourage you to do it. It's really good for your brain. It's really helpful. And also, what I'm hoping to do with these, and I saw that I did get at least one yawn.
I yawn. I
something, the more our brain says, "Ooh, is that a possibility? I'm not gonna do that." And especially yawning.
So
There's
is that why they say yawning is contagious? You said it's a mirror.
It's a mirror neuron thing. So if I see you yawning and my brain says, "Oh yeah," it's gonna yawn as well. It's empathetic. We're doing it together to connect with each other. And research has come out recently. There's this guy who wrote, he writes about neurotheology, so it's like neuroscience and theology, and gave like the top 8 things that he recommends in this very long book. And number 8 was yawning. Number 1 was face. I love dogs a lot. So,
Can you tell me the
Yeah.
name of that person? I'm sorry.
yeah, absolutely. Let me find it.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's Mark somebody or other, but let me find that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So if we're in the overwhelmed state, I want to point out these couple of things or couple of ways you might describe it. So we're going to talk about what does overwhelmed state look like, and then whether we're in it or see someone else in it, how can we support each other and coming back to a safe space of safety. So freeze, that might be one way, right? You're just kind of held, that tense holding. Overwhelmed, we actually feel like we're kind of buried underneath something, drowning. And then the last one we talked a little bit about already, which was dissociating. That's when we sort of feel disconnected from the body. And there's a lot more like super interesting things to talk about as it relates to that. But what I want to get to is shutdown. We hopefully, whether we ourselves or we're working with someone or connecting with somebody or even thinking about like working with a group of people, shutdown is when we have to take a break. Our hope is that we can take a break before then. And there's some different ways we can do it. So these are the types of things that I talk about with my clients and I work and practice myself. Really, it's asking myself, what is a way that I can move back to safety? What's a way that, and it's just a brain thing, y'all. This isn't something about being better or worse than anyone else. It's not being tougher or stronger. It just has to do with if my brain is feeling overwhelmed or even in a high state of threat or stress. How do I support it? Just by moving back to something that feels a little safer. So the first one I'm going to talk about, which super briefly, is what we call self-soothe. And it's really just doing something using your 5 senses that feels in some ways like comforting or pleasurable. So it could be like a smell that you really like. It could be, I already talked about brownies or chocolate, right? I'm also like really big into like coffee or tea. It could be like just visualizing something and in my brain thinking about something, imagining something that's pleasurable. Or it could be looking around the room and saying, is there anything in this room that sort of catches my attention that I can just kind of connect to? The paintings in here, I've enjoyed. I took a class last year, where we looked at some of these paintings, and they're like all over this building. It's crazy. But there's something about being curious around like, is there anything in this that catches my attention, kind of pulls me into an experience of maybe feeling a little more safe? Yes, I love that yawn. The second one is supportive touch. I have a dog that I've ran a lot of places. I almost brought her today, and I did not, because I thought I would have needed to ask for permission. But whether it's an animal or whether it's a friend, whether it's anyone who, or maybe even a tree, kind of sitting against a tree, some sort of touch or support where we notice our body feeling connection and pressure. So it could be even just doing it with ourselves, like holding our hands. It could be giving ourselves a hug. It could be giving a friend a hug. This is another reason why the pandemic, I think, has been so hard on all of us, is there's more distance between everyone. And so this question around where am I getting support? How am I getting touched? Not in any sort of way, except that it is connected. It releases oxytocin in the brain, and that's really good stuff as it relates to feeling safe. The next one is pretty cool. It's based on something called the dive reflex, where basically, if I'm somebody who tends to run hot. So if I am noticing I'm feeling kind of intense about something, if I can change my temperature and get cold, actually shift the part of my brain that says, hey, chill out, literally. But it's based on something called the dive reflex, where basically if you were to, and don't do this, if you were to drop a baby in a pool, we naturally hold our breaths and our heart rate slows down. It's a natural instinct. It's so cool. And so it's the same thing. If I change my temperature and cool it down, my heart rate's going to slow, and I might actually feel a little bit safer. So we can do that by running our hands under really cold water, like our wrists, putting an ice pack on the back of our neck. Just like super little things. Walking into a freezer. I know people who work at restaurants, they do that a lot. They're like, go walk in that freezer, cool off, pop back out. The next one's breathing. Very basic. We're all breathing. But breathing intentionally slowly. It's actually slowing down our breath. Sometimes even in a contemplative way, I think we can kind of connect this to prayer. Doing sort of prayer and breath as a way to remind ourselves that we're connected. And then the last one is just being a little silly. Laughing actually really quickly shifts us into a state of safety. And it's also really hard to laugh if we're feeling scared. So finding a way to connect with something that brings you a little bit of laughter can help you feel a little safer. And this is something we can also introduce, whether it's in our congregations or in our friend groups or in our families. Identifying ways that we can incorporate things that are going to experience safety as a group. So this is somebody smiling. You can see their crinkles in their eyes. That's a real smile. When we smile, when we laugh, when we raise our eyebrows just a little bit, it actually sends information to our brains that says, hey, cool, yeah, we're doing good, yeah. And so we can actually intentionally do that on purpose for ourselves and for the people around us. Ultimately, my hope today that you'll walk away from this conversation is that community mental health and what we're talking about related to responses related to trauma or stress is actually the key to neurobiological resilience and strength. We can practice this for ourselves. We can also invite people to practice with us. We can practice this in our friend groups, our families, and our communities. So thank you so much. Thank you all for coming today. And I hope that you continue to learn. And remember, there's always something to notice that will amaze you. This is me and Pine. This is my little puppy.
Aww.
So this guy got really, these little things got really big. But yeah, if y'all have questions, I'm happy to hang out. I know that we're close to the 5:30 mark. But also just thank y'all so much for being here.